Hi, Matt Sinclair. Today I want to talk about how UK policymakers are looking to promote a UK role in the future of science and technology, based on an interesting event I attended earlier this week. It was under Chatham House rules, so I won't be linking statements to people, but I think some interesting takeaways in terms of how people are thinking about this problem. And I've been thinking about it myself since, and kind of how you might take some of this forward. So the event was hosted by the Centre for Policy Studies, so thank you to them, kindly supported by HPE. The attendees, just for context, was a mix of policymakers, business leaders, academics, associations, and the like. A pretty good range of sector perspectives, and I think a good chance to reflect on this element in overall tech policy, which I touched on a bit in the chip war video recently, and does, I think, sit alongside for policymakers a lot there. What they're looking to achieve in tech regulation is what they're looking to achieve in, for want of a better term, tech industrial policy. Part of the background here is obviously that a lot of countries are concerned about their role in high-tech industries, particularly semiconductors. There's been a lot of support in China over a number of years for their industry. Obviously, there's a large base in Taiwan, in South Korea, and you've had the US and the EU announcing large subsidy programs in recent years. And that raises the question of what the UK should do in response. And I think it's pretty obvious that the answer cannot be to answer like for like in every sector where other countries are putting in place subsidies. You're going to lose a lot of those battles, and you're going to pay a high cost, partly in terms of financial cost of the subsidy, but more importantly in terms of misspent talent, initiative, executive attention, etc. So you've kind of got two strategic options. The first, and I think often the right answer, might be grab the popcorn. If other countries are subsidizing chip fabs, for example, that creates a load of opportunities for suppliers to and industrial consumers of those fabs, the rest of the supply chain. If you have strengths in that supply chain, you can do pretty well by staying out of the fight and enjoying the fruits of that subsidy. Now, that might mean other businesses that are recognizably part of the chip industry, e.g. design. Someone at the event mentioned advanced packaging. There's a number of areas where the UK does have strengths in the industry itself. Or it might mean associated goods and services, the business services that underpin these kinds of global supply chains. Or, of course, the very many digital businesses, let's think about, for example, like AI software, for example, that make use of the outputs of all this chip innovation. Now, that doesn't mean there's no role for good public policy, but there may still be things you need to get right in order to play that part in those supply chains. But it means the policy is almost always to go where others are looking less. It's to go where your comparative advantage is at the start, and often not to compete on the big, dollar sign industrial subsidies. There might be tougher choices in other sectors, though. I don't want to pretend this is always going to go one way. If, for example, we're discovering again that green industries often follow the subsidies more than anything else, there might be a choice between accepting that they're going to wither to some extent now the UK is no longer where the biggest subsidy checks can be found, or changing that by putting money into the sector. If you're going for it, I think you need to think seriously about what it will take to win, what winning even really is. Is it always going to be a temporary game, assuming that we can't keep subsidies up forever? And there might be some game theory around how it will affect the actions of other countries that are as committed as we are in this sector. Look, the popcorn option is definitely more fun. I think there's an acknowledgement that was going to be the best route for the UK in most circumstances, but obviously there have been calls for much bigger checks out there in sort of British politics in recent months, taking more of that fight approach. But I think this dilemma is the right way to think about the choice that we've got to make in the context of rising tech industrial policy globally. Another topic that came up a lot, where there are public projects, and there will be classic public goods like scientific research, is the need to move fast. So a lot of frustration with the slow process in government around projects like exascale computing and things like that. business cases that runs hundreds of pages and things like that. Now, obviously, you need to be realistic about what's achievable here. Ministers and officials are using other people's money, so there should be more care over how it's spent than when businesses make their own decisions. However, there clearly is a problem that taking longer often makes projects less worthwhile in itself, particularly in science and tech, where there's a premium on staying as near the technological frontier as possible. So, if you end up spending the same money, but spending it more slowly, you haven't really achieved anything in terms of expenditure control. I think there is work to be done though. I think that Treasury is often concerned about departments underspending capital budgets. It's not always as simple as Treasury wants to spend less, therefore Treasury erects obstacles to spending. So I think there might be a compromise to be struck where the process is simplified, so you're asking fewer questions, but you're answering them to a higher analytical standard. I also think the business case process itself, I think a lot of ministers would quite like this, could be more focused on delivery, more attention to that Gantt chart, where delays are most likely, where policymakers could accelerate progress through supporting changes in other areas, where are the opportunities to do this faster, so the business case process starts to become an asset to moving fast rather than being seen purely as an obstacle, which is definitely not what people working around business cases want them to be. I think it's also important to remember other obstacles, though. I think the business cases I think loom large for people who are going through those kinds of processes, but there's a lot of other obstacles to getting things done in the UK. So whether that's the unbelievably long time it takes to get a grid connection, I've had 7 to 9 years, the UK's creaking planning system, or challenges in the organisations that are being funded. Can the universities get projects going fast enough, for example? You wouldn't want to create this growing backlog of behind schedule projects, tying up investment, expertise, initiative in projects that aren't delivering. You also wouldn't want to skew project selection too much towards those projects that avoid this, say by working within existing sites. Obviously, it's great if at the margin that allows a project to be more efficient, all good. But if it starts to limit your ambitions or skew your ambitions in important ways, that could be its own kind of cost to these other obstacles to development. Finally, I just wanted to talk about other policy that's relevant to this superpower status that we're hoping to achieve. I think the first point is that all of this very much starts from UK universities. Their quality is part of what makes this aspiration plausible. If you ask why the UK, why is this a thing that we can reasonably hope to achieve, it's kind of hard to imagine it without the universities. There's obviously been a lot of talk about the financial pressures universities are under, despite reforms over the 90s and 2000s to match their funding to student numbers better. But that conversation can't all be about sheer volume of funding. I know Patrick Collison at Stripe has looked at this, and while you can quibble over the details, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that science is getting less productive over time. We might want to think about how we fund research, what academic career paths look like, all sorts of issues like that, where about how you convert science dollars into science outcomes, science pounds into science outcomes. I also think policymakers need to take the implications of current regulatory policy seriously. I've done a lot about the UK DMCC, particularly the Telegraph article a couple of weeks ago, and there's more to come. But I think it's a massive leap to think the unchecked, discretionary regulatory control of major tech businesses, which that digital markets law would allow for, is really compatible with being a science and tech superpower. It won't regulate newer, smaller businesses directly, but if you undermine that dynamic competition, if you undermine that exploration of new business models, I think it's going to put a cap on their ambitions and space to grow in practice. In the end, the kind of being the most subject of regulatory control and a science and tech superpower, I think is just going to be a very hard circle to square. And finally, the focus was more on public investment than private. I think that anyone was kind of not seeing a role there, but the UK doesn't do terribly by European standards, as I understand it, in terms of things like VC funding. But if the aspiration is science and tech superpower, we're going to need to do a lot better. And I think that investment won't all be about VC funds investing in startups either. I think there's a chain from the ability of major investors to put money into UK science and tech, both those startups, but also big facilities, etc. And that's where regulations like Solvency II come in and other restrictions that make it harder for pools of capital to get allocated to science and tech. And when you think about the supply of investable opportunities, I think that's where you need to do something about planning and other restrictions on development. That's where the investment zones, which they exist still, but in quite a different form, were designed to unlock that planning process, and the incentives to invest, which is where broader tax policy comes in, trying to make sure that you have capital that is ready, willing, and able to support UK innovation. You could add other issues here, like skills, for example, and I think there's actually been some quite good work that's gone on in skills, and actually kind of stability and delivery is probably the priority more than anything. But definitely, there are kind of running sores like the apprentice levy. Look, you get all of that right, where the UK plays, how it invests where it's needed, strong universities, careful regulation, strong private investment, and those aspirations to superpower status in science and tech start to sound credible. I just would be, this isn't something that we should, I think, see as beyond the UK. It would already be a fair description of our role in other industries, like creative industries, for example. I thought it was a really interesting event. I hope you found this interesting. Any thoughts, please do drop them down in the comments below. Any likes and subscribes appreciated. And I look forward to speaking to you next time.